Everybody's mucking in and doing their job, wearing a great big smile. We're gonna hang out the washing on the Siegfried line. Have you any dirty washing, Mother dear?
He's torn, ripped in opposite directions, pulled this way and that. Can 10-year-old Sefton Delmer even tell which is the real him? He is the only British boy in a German school in the opening months of World War I. In the packed hall, his normally calm headmaster is screeching about the British, who have brought this war upon peace-loving Germany and its peace-loving Kaiser. The British are jealous of Germany's new wealth and expanding territories. These assassins have plotted to encircle us, and now it is a moment for death and glory. Sefton's friends hiss at him, "Traitor!" After school, they surround him, and one sets upon him with his fists. Every morning assemblies grow more fervent. They march round the hall crying, "God, Kaiser, Fatherland." Sefton must march too, and although he knows it isn't right, he can't help but be thrilled by these hymns to German gunsmiths, hammering the steel-hard German heart. Who, in this moment, is the real Sefton Delmer? The one singing German war songs, or the one muttering resistance in English under his breath? This splitting of the self would become the source of Delmer's skill. He would grow up to become a genius of propaganda, famed for his ability to leave his own personality behind, climb inside the enemy's mind, and play tricks on them from the inside. But this quality would also be his greatest vulnerability. In 1929, after years away from Germany, 24-year-old Delmer returned as the chief Berlin correspondent of the Daily Express. In Weimar, Berlin, he found that his fluid identity was an advantage that would help him penetrate the backstage of the Nazi propaganda show. When in February he first saw Hitler speak, he was unimpressed. The Sportpalast, Berlin's biggest indoor venue, could hold 14,000 people. Now, when Delmer sauntered in past the stormtroopers, it was half empty. Hitler was on stage, flushed, yelling about oranges. "We Germans must not eat oranges. We must consume no fruit, no food which we have not grown ourselves." A crackpot, Delmer thought, and walked out again. But by September 1930, the Nazis were the second biggest party in Parliament, and the second time Delmer heard him speak, he paid more attention. Sitting as close as possible in the packed hall, he noted Hitler's popping blue eyes, how sweat seeped into his cheap suit, how he stirred the normally prim middle classes into aggressive exultation. At the end, the crowd sang, "Deutschland, Deutschland über alles." This was the moment Delmer decided to penetrate the Nazis' inner circle. I determined to get to know this miracle man, study the secret of his appeal, and find out what use he was going to make of it. In February 1931, Ernst Röhm was inspecting his stormtroopers at the Sportpalast. He gave the Nazi salute as he entered, and his men returned the Sieg Heil. Behind him, his aide-de-camp also saluted. The aide-de-camp was Sefton Delmer. Acting as Röhm's assistant was a condition of attending the meeting. This was a private event, no journalists allowed. But Röhm wanted Delmer there to prove to the English that the stormtroopers were not thugs, but a disciplined fighting force, to ensure that the English and French didn't make too much of a fuss as Hitler came closer to power. Soon he would want to integrate the stormtroopers into the German army, and that needed approval from the victorious powers in World War I. For Delmer, it was a chance to gain the Nazi leader's trust. You can hear an actor's delight in his memoirs. "I squared back my shoulders, turned down the corners of my mouth in correct disdain, and became Röhm's extra ADC. Orderlies rushed up, clicked heels and saluted. I saluted back, rather more negligently, with arm half bent, as befitted my rank. It was wonderful fun." What precisely was fun about it? Just the thrill of getting away with it? Or did a part of him enjoy the role? We marched down the aisle. The huge arena was crammed with stormtroopers standing rigidly to attention, row upon row, 3,500 of them. As he passed these pale, drawn men, he could see both the power and the vulnerability of the Nazi experiment. They came from all parts of society. Some were there from patriotic motives. Others were hungry for loot and high positions. Many were unemployed. The Nazis aimed to forge a unified people's community from this fractured rabble. Delmer's goal would become to divide them. As they drove away, Röhm chuckled. "You make a fine ADC, Herr Delmer. Why don't you come to Munich and join us in our magnificent new brown house?" Delmer's act had worked. "Do you think I could talk with Herr Hitler?" "Of course. I shall arrange it myself." A week later, he was on his way to Munich. Röhm greeted Delmer and took him on a tour around the building. It was calculated to make a grand impression on him. SS men crouched over maps in a mock war game scenario of invading Poland, and maps showing how many thousands of stormtroopers were located in every town. Hitler finally appeared in cheap shoes and a double-breasted suit. He had sallow skin and overly arranged hair. He reminded Delmer of ex-soldier travelling salesmen, humiliated veterans struggling to settle into a civilian life. Before Delmer could speak, he launched into a tirade about how terrible the French were. Unlike the English, of course. Britain's interests were similar to Germany's. They were both Nordic peoples. They should ally. That the only thing Germany wanted was a free hand in the East. There were many occasions on which I talked with Hitler, Delmer later recalled, and every time the same thing happened. I would put a question, he would reply, and his reply would swell out into an oration. He would be shouting as though he had the Sports Palace crowd before him, not just a solitary British reporter. Then, as quickly as the oration swelled, it was switched off, and Hitler departed for his next meeting. But Delmer had enough for his exclusive. "Herr Hitler talks to the Daily Express," ran the headline on May the 4th. The article communicated to the English public Hitler's offer of a British-German alliance. It also made clear that Delmer thought Hitler was destined for great things. He predicted that with his rise, Germany would soon join the ranks of Europe's fascist powers. The article must have pleased the Nazi leadership. Later that year, Delmer got another exclusive one-on-one with Hitler. In order to ingratiate himself further with the Nazi elites, Delmer invited them to his parties. He invited dancing girls and princes to make the fascists feel as important and relaxed as possible. He even bought a giant Bechstein piano for Hitler's press attaché, Ernst Putzi Hanfstaengl, to play. Röhm would pass out drunk, face down on the dinner table. Goering would play with Delmer's pet parrot, laughing as it pooped on his white dinner jacket. And while Delmer was busy wooing the Nazis, they were also busy wooing him. Röhm aimed to put British minds at ease about the Nazis. He assured Delmer that the anti-Semitism shouldn't be taken too seriously. It was just another act to get more voters. Delmer now realized he thought he was a British spy. Whether it was their hope he could be a conduit to the British Secret Services, his articles, the parties, the piano, or just the way Delmer put Hitler at ease, the Nazis chose him as the only non-Nazi journalist to accompany Hitler in the crucial second round of the presidential election of April 1932. On April the 6th, Delmer wrote in the Express, "My ears are still ringing. But that is not due to the roar of the motors of the great triple-engined airplane in which Hitler, his most intimate staff, and myself have been flying for the last 12 hours, from one meeting place to another. It is due to the wild cheering and enthusiastic singing of the overwhelming crowds." About 200,000 people had seen Hitler in one day as he flew between 4 cities, each vying with the other in the fanatical fervour of Hitler worship. But the influence worked both ways. The sincere adulation mesmerised him, Delmer wrote on the eve of World War II, that he lived on the emotion and mass hysteria he produced in his audiences, sucking it into himself as he orated, then spewing it out again at them with compound interest. On the evening that Hitler became Chancellor, Delmer was walking through the crowds and was reminded of the performative patriotism of 1914. Everyone ecstatically Heil Hitlered everyone else to prove what super-Nazis they were, even though a few weeks back they were contemptuously shrugging him off as that man. When he got home, Delmer found his butler teaching his parrot to say Heil Hitler. He ordered him to stop, but the little anecdote underscores his view of our relationship to propaganda. We're always somehow parroting it. We are not brainwashed zombies, but conscious actors in a performance. Delmer portrayed Nazis in an almost uncomfortably comedic way. The Kaiser's son, August Wilhelm, gave Nazi speeches with his high, falsetto voice and knock-kneed, spindly legs, emphasized by his stormtrooper breeches. Performing, along with the prince, was a robust, down-to-earth Munich plumber. Between the two of them, they made a good act, the prince and the plumber. His articles expressed increasing distaste for this new dictatorship, but in private, Delmer was getting as close to the Nazis as possible, and for some, it looked like he was way too intimate. In a letter to the Foreign Office in 1933, the British ambassador to Berlin sent a report by a Mr. Breen about a party at the home of the correspondent of the Daily Express. Delmer, the ambassador wrote, was probably the only one outside the charmed circle of Nazi leaders who can mobilize the circus in full strength. The night Breen attended, Putzi Hanfstangl announced that he had written a solemn funereal tune. Everyone cracked up laughing. Was it for the Jews, the Marxists? Someone had a hilarious idea. All Jews should be buried to the tune of this new march. He played into the night, with the circus singing along. Breen left at 3 a.m., with the fascist fun still going strong. His memo intimates that Delmer was alarmingly accommodating to his guests' whims. In his memoir, Delmer, as if replying to this report, wrote, "This was a story, and a reporter will shake hands with the devil himself on a story." But Delmer was no Nazi appeaser. As early as 1933, he advised a military response. His intimacy with the leaders showed him the extent of their ambitions, but questions around this intimacy always followed him. How had he ingratiated himself quite so closely? And if he was just playing a role, how much of himself did he put in it? In late 1933, he became the Express Paris correspondent, but he returned to Germany in 1934 to catch the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler's bloody purge of Röhm and the stormtroopers. The propaganda ministry refused to give the numbers of the dead, but Delmer published a list of people he knew had been killed, estimating 108 murdered. He was immediately informed by the secret police that he was being expelled from Germany. That, he wrote, was the end of my beautiful friendship with Hitler. By July 1940, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, Holland, Belgium, Norway and Denmark had all been subsumed in Hitler's new order for a Nazi Europe. German boats were massing along the Channel. Britain was isolated and desperate. At 4 p.m. on the 19th of July, Hitler was to address the packed Reichstag. As well as politicians, the army leadership was present. But when Hitler spoke, it was not his usual bellicose address. "I prophesy a great empire will be destroyed, which it was never my intention to destroy, or even to harm. In this hour, I feel it is my duty towards my conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Britain. I can see no reason why this war must go on. I am grieved to think of the sacrifices which it will claim." He was, he continued, sated by his conquests. He had taken revenge for World War I, undone the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles, reclaimed Germany's lost territories, and gained many others. He had always prophesied this, and now his prophecies had all come true. Now he had a message for the British. If they gave up their air attacks on Germany, then he was ready to sue for peace. It was only the warmonger Churchill, the Jewish newspapers, and the Freemasons who had dragged Britain into this war. Why bother defending defeated Poland? France was occupied, and there was nothing the British could do about that. Britain was alone. Why not join Germany if there was no way it could beat Germany? Goebbels, who was behind this strategy, wanted this peace offer to split the British government and public. He reasoned that it would take them at least 2 days to respond. The answer came within the hour. Not, as might be expected, from the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister, but from Sefton Delmer, speaking on the BBC's German service. He addressed Hitler personally. "You have asked my advice on what Britain thinks before. Let me tell you what we here in Britain think of this appeal of yours to what you are pleased to call our reason and common sense." He paused. "Herr Führer and Reichskanzler," he said with mock piety, before changing his voice to something much nastier. "We hurl it right back at you, right in your evil-smelling teeth." The message was shocking, but so was the manner with which it was delivered. BBC announcements were normally restrained. This language was borderline Berlin gutter slang, though well-spoken, self-conscious, and aware of its own theatricality. The Nazis hadn't expected a response so fast, or that it would come from Delmer. And not only the Germans were taken aback. The honourable member for Ipswich protested that the answer to Hitler had been given by a person of no importance. The Minister of Information responded that Mr. Sefton Delmer took care that nothing he said should commit the government. It was a commentary rather than an official reply. This came 3 days later from Downing Street. It echoed Delmer's position, if in more restrained language. The British had seen how Hitler's peace offers in Europe were an inevitable prelude to consequent invasion. None of his propaganda peace games would be indulged. He couldn't be trusted. The German press was now instructed to treat Britain's rejection as a war crime. They should argue that Germany attacked the country with all the fierceness it could muster. "Britain will not see reason until she has suffered the first blows," said Goebbels. On August the 1st, Hitler signed the order for airstrikes against British cities. Now that the war had come to Britain, Delmer's talks on the BBC German service excited him much more than reporting. Here was a chance to really help the cause, to use his knowledge of Germany to undermine the Nazis. When he was asked to lecture on the German BBC, it felt like being given a knighthood. Delmer was no longer just reporting. He was subverting. But not everyone was impressed with his performances. Since the war began, Delmer had been asking to join the intelligence services. Wasn't he perfect? He knew the Nazi elites and understood the country. But would the mysterious they give me a chance to do a secret job? Would they be ready to make use of me? For even though he heard he had come close, he was ultimately rejected. He never knew precisely why, but felt that his very closeness to the Nazis made him suspect, that being born in Berlin militated against me. His frustration was not only personal, it was professional. Delmer thought the BBC German service's strategy all wrong. He believed it was full of worthy intellectual émigrés who wanted to convert ordinary Germans to their high ideals. Listening to them, Delmer said, was like Maida Vale calling Hampstead, one part of émigré London talking to another. How could that ever help get under the psychic skin of those under the sway of Nazi propaganda? As the Nazis captured one country after another with minimal casualties, as Hitler's popularity, or at least his aura of invincibility, seemed only to increase, this seemed to Delmer ever more hopeless. In my view, all this attempt to convert Germans to rebellion against Hitler by argument was a waste of breath. The Germans would only begin to listen and react to that sort of thing when they realized the war was lost, and it was better for them to abandon Hitler than to fight on. Delmer had seen the psychological power of early Nazi propaganda. You needed to tackle people's connection to the Nazis at its root, the need for belonging, the sadism, and the simplified identity they offered. On September the 7th, 1940, the skies over the Thames estuary suddenly turned dark as vast squadrons of German planes flew in arrow-shaped formations, one after another, toward London. This was the first week of the Blitz. It would last 9 months. A Home Intelligence report noted how factors which contribute to the strain on morale are, of course, as much psychological as material. Listening tension, for example, anticipation of planes and bombs, is one to which little official notice has been paid. Few people are using ear pads or understand that the diminution of noise can help lessen their state of anxiety. To ease the listening tension, Londoners huddled around their wireless sets. On September the 11th, Churchill made a speech on the radio. These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are, of course, a part of Hitler's invasion plans. He hopes, by killing large numbers of civilians and women and children, that he will terrorize and cow the people of this mighty imperial city. This is a time for everyone to stand together and hold firm, as they are doing. People thought he sounded tired. That evening, as the Blitz bore down once again, some were tuning into something a little less grandiloquent. Workers' Challenge ran every night at 8:10, 9 and 10. It starred East End Cockneys talking about their war experience. Tonight, one of its regulars, Bill, discussed the latest air raid with his friend, Jack. Jack was concerned about rumours that the air raid sirens were going off too late, not giving the workers enough time to take shelter properly. Bill was convinced this was deliberate. The nobs are afraid their profits will drop, so they don't care a monkey's bugger about what happens to the workers. Oh, stop pulling me leg, Bill, answered Jack. I knows you like to take a rise out of me, but no kidding, mate. Do you think there's something going on between the bosses and these mess-ups when there's an air raid? Now listen here, Jack, mate. Use your noodle for once. A couple of weeks back the alarm was delayed for a quarter of an hour before the raid started, while the last one wasn't started at all. So, what do you think? But I still can't see where the bosses come into it. Why, you bleeding twerp, it's as easy as ABC. A delayed alarm means more production from the workers and more profit for the bosses. And besides, they don't care about Jerry dropping a few more bombs on the factory as long as they're out of the danger zone. With Jack slowly coming round, Bill turned to what had to be done. The workers have been bloody mugs, but that can change. The workers make the munitions. They can halt these hellish air raids if they rise up against their capitalist bosses and their lackeys in government, halt production, and stop the war. This was pretty typical fare for Bill. When he wasn't agitating other workers, he lectured the audience. The so-called bosses of ours are all swine who've taken a yid bribe. This movement is British. Come out into the streets and put it into action. Workers of Britain, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. But Workers' Challenge did not actually represent a British movement. Bill, Jack, and the other characters were broadcasting from a well-guarded villa in Berlin, part of Germany's covert radio operation, the Bureau Concordia. The Cockneys were played by British prisoners of war. They had joined the Bureau after being offered far more preferable living conditions. They wore their own clothes, were provided with tobacco and alcohol, and could visit a brothel once a week. Of the thousands of prisoners available, 8 agreed to join. Workers' Challenge was one of 4 British stations run by the Bureau. Radio Caledonia called for a Scotland free of international entanglements, conducted not in the interests of Jews and capitalists, but the Scottish people. Christian Peace Movement was meant for conscientious objectors, and at the new British Broadcasting Service, upper-class gentlemen talking in a BBC-like style, but with very un-BBC-like content. In the poshest of tones, NBBS called on its loyal listeners to hang Churchill and his Jewish bosses, let's make peace and cut our losses. The stations were directed by Goebbels himself. So what should the British Ministry of Information do about the Bureau Concordia? Was it finally time to try something and someone different? This was when Sefton Delmer received a telegram. Suggest you resign from the Express. Important job awaits you. How would you like to run an RU? Leonard Ingrams of the Special Operations Executive asked when the new recruit reported to his Mayfair office. What's an RU? A research unit. Didn't you know? No, I didn't. What did they research? They had nothing to do with research. This was the code name for Freedom Radios, anti-Nazi resistance radio stations that seemed to be transmitting from occupied Europe, while actually run by émigrés based in England, all working under the intelligence services. We want you to start a right-wing RU and suggest you take charge of it with full editorial and political control. It had been noted that the Bureau Concordia's Workers' Challenge drew in listeners by using the foulest language ever. Well, Ingrams continued, my minister thinks we should reply in kind, and as he is a socialist, he thinks a right-wing station would be the appropriate one to carry the filth. Go to it then. It is a great chance for you to show your ingenuity. There are no limits. No holds are barred. On May the 23rd, 1941, a small black limousine pulled up outside a red brick house in the village of Aspley Gees, Bedfordshire, on the outskirts of the Woburn Abbey estate. It was home to Sefton Delmer, and today was the debut recording of his new radio station, his attempt to crack the seemingly impregnable edifice of Nazi propaganda. But for this task, he needed to solve a problem: how to engage German audiences and dig into the attraction the Nazi propaganda held for Germans. Woburn Abbey was home to Britain's secret information war against the Nazis. It was a vast Palladian palace surrounded by acres of land. The dukes had been prime ministers and trusted emissaries of the crown, but the current incumbent was different. He wrote articles in far-right journals urging peace with Hitler. The only reason he had not been interned was that the secret services considered him inept. His father had lent the estate to the government for its propaganda operations. There were departments dedicated to dreaming up rumours to spread through Axis countries, leaflets to drop over enemy lines, forged Nazi documents, money and stamps. Émigrés from across Europe wrote newspapers to support resistance movements. French, Italian, German, Czech and Danish resistance stations were already running. But Delmer was about to transform the field. The staff included many freaks, some genuine antiques, several fakes, and a few geniuses, remembered one contemporary. On account of the shortage of men, we relied mainly on women, who were in the majority. 2 were expert propagandists, who ran their own section with men under them. Delmer didn't want to target any type of political idealism. That wasn't where he thought the system's vulnerabilities lay. People's motivations were often a source of disappointment to the ideological Nazis. Consider denunciations. The Nazis demanded that Germans report on one another for even vaguely seditious comments, which they did in vast numbers. But according to the SS, only 24% did this for ideological reasons. Most did so to get back at people they didn't like, or whose jobs they coveted. It was this lack of idealism that Delmer wanted to tap into. Hitler had once told him that there's an inner Schweinhund in every man. This common insult was a reference to one's weaker self. We must, said Delmer, appeal to the pig dog inside every German. Give him a patriotic reason for doing what he would like to do from self-interest. Talk to him about his Führer and his fatherland and all that sort of thing, and at the same time inject some item of news into his mind which will make him think, and if possible act, in a way that is contrary to the efficient conduct of Hitler's war. As Britain refused to break under the Blitz and British bombers flew over Berlin, Germans were getting anxious the war would never end. The target of their discontent was Nazi bureaucrats. Delmer wanted to give a new label to this self-serving elite. He had plenty of material. Rumours about Nazi corruption were rife. We should serve up inside dope, which is new and true. Talks should strike a tough note frequently, should be rude and robustly abusive. He called his project Black Propaganda. I think we should try out a new type of black radio on the Germans, one that undermines Hitler not by opposing him, but by pretending to be all for him and his war. We ought to be able to get across all manner of subversive stories under a cover of nationalist patriotic clichés. What Delmer was proposing was like nothing that the British had tried before. His idea was that as Germans surfed their shortwave radios, they would suddenly encounter what sounded like the insider conversations of a clandestine military organization. Instead of pushing content onto audiences aggressively, Delmer was allowing them to feel they had stumbled onto something quite by chance. Our listeners are intended to feel they are eavesdropping on the private wireless of a secret organization. They find that we are anti-communists who once thought Hitler pretty good, fought alongside him in fact, but are now appalled at the corruption, godlessness, profiteering, selfishness, rivalries, party-above-the-law system which the party has instituted. The soldier sending these subversive messages would give members of the organization his salaciously outspoken views of what was going on and plenty of inside information. The station would be a nightly demonstration of a growing split between the conservative elements of the army and the radicals of the Nazi Party. The organization's leader, der Chef, would be a foul-mouthed Prussian soldier full of racism and resentment. Churchill he would insult as a drunk Jew. No German, Delmer thought, would ever suspect English propaganda of insulting its own leadership so strongly, and he needed a speaker who could deliver it with the necessary vitriol. Berliner Peter Hans Seckelmann was a journalist and writer of detective novels. He arrived in England in 1936 and stayed permanently because he was angered at the treatment of Jews under the Nazis. In London, he worked as a literary agent and representative of a German publishing company. His MI5 file describes him as anti-Nazi, quiet, serious, sensible. The agent who interviewed him says, "He impressed me extremely favourably. He is quiet-spoken, not in the least bombastic, and has a delightful personality. He seems to be one of the very few Germans who are not only loyal to us, but who have severed all connections with Germany." When war began, Seckelmann joined the Pioneer Corps and risked his life defusing unexploded German bombs. Not content with this, he volunteered to be parachuted behind the German lines with special operations, and then he was passed on to Delmer. His voice seemed to me just right for der Chef, virile and resonant with just the right trace of Berlin drawl. First transcripts of the shows appear in September 1941. The US State Department teams following Nazi media were convinced this was a genuine German station. On September the 9th, der Chef lamented the decrease in butter and meat rations, attacked the Minister for Rations, and said, "It's a pity we can't cut our meat from the buttocks of the SS." On September the 16th, he complained that France is filled with saboteurs and spies. No submarine can leave the port without the knowledge of those shit Britons and shit Americans. The shit Gestapo is sleeping in the day and drinking in excess and fornicating in the night together with the spies and saboteurs. Then he went after the head of the Gestapo in Paris. Abets, don't think we don't know about your Mademoiselle Nicole Bardot in the Rue de Paris. We know everything, even the price of the apartment and the Rolls-Royce. Yes, sir, she needs an English car. One contemporary recalled that de Chef's broadcasts resembled small-scale theatrical productions, and even minor details of presentation were discussed and rehearsed. When the Nazis took over a monastery to use as a military hospital, a fact, de Chef spun out a lurid tale of sexual depravity, a fantasy. 200 SS men marched into the monastery and took possession of it. A bawdy house was made out of the monastery for the SS men and their whores. The holy mass gowns are used as sheets, and the women wear precious lace tunics made out of choir robes with nothing underneath them. These pigs drink liquor out of the holy vessels. How can honest German soldiers risk their lives in a destructive battle when these blasphemers at home do whatever they like and take over one cloister after another for their filthy purposes? Here was Delmer's approach, acting appalled at something that was actually titillating to his audience, while at the same time breaking the taboo on insulting the SS and deepening the rift between the party and the army, the party and the people. Next, Johannes Reinholz joined Delmer and Seckelmann. He and his Jewish wife had fled Berlin, where he wrote for conservative newspapers of the Prussian military aristocracy, the sort of environment der Chef would have emerged from. He was also the stepson of one of Berlin's most famous Jewish cabaret impresarios. Reinholz wrote scripts and played the role of the adjutant, who introduced der Chef. Soon, more stars of the German cabaret scene joined Delmer. Perhaps this is one way to characterize der Chef, the last great Berlin cabaret act, subverting the Nazis from abroad. The naming and shaming became more specific. Mrs. Schmidt of Vienna, Maxing Street 47, has informed the police that the following things were stolen from her pantry: 3 dozen sausages, 5 Westphalian hams, 2 pails of Danish butter, 450 preserved eggs. At a time of rationing, this list of luxury food was designed to make audiences both lick their lips and rumble with jealousy. Mrs. Schmidt is not an ordinary woman. Oh no, she is the wife of the minister, Dr. Paul Schmidt. In summer 1941, Max Braun became head of intelligence. Leader of the Socialist Party in Saarland, he had lost a referendum to Hitler in 1935. Now he pored over reports from agents of the Socialist Party, giving detailed accounts of the mood in Germany. He combined these with newspaper stories and assembled a catalogue of 60,000 biographies, from the Führer down to local Nazi officials. If I required an engine driver living in the village of Kassel, Delmer explained, or a greengrocer's shop in Berlin's Hansa district, my files could provide them. What Braun gave, Delmer embellished. Delmer insisted that every lie had to be told so that it felt like the truth. And a lot of the time the truth was damning in itself. Intercepted letters were another source. The American-born wife of a German industrialist in Cologne simply adored telling her friend, Mrs. Ruth Stradling of Nevada, about the lavish parties she and her husband hosted and visited. Outraged, der Chef revealed how one Nazi comrade treated his guests to a magnificent cake shaped like Cologne Cathedral, just as ordinary Germans had their sugar rations cut. But Delmer wasn't just interested in causing rifts. He believed in propaganda that changed behavior. The idea of action is planted in the mind of the subject without letting him see that he is being influenced at all. This was revolutionary. Der Chef would act appalled at things many people were doing, such as buying up clothes on the black market, thus normalising it even as he condemned it, and making his listeners feel that it was a safe thing to do. Der Chef, judging from the intelligence agency's sources, was an instant success. Nobody is willing to admit he listens, but one is constantly being asked by acquaintances, "Have you heard the story that—" and then follows the news, broadcast the previous morning. Delmer's aim was to reverse engineer the language of Nazi anti-Semitism back onto the Nazi leadership themselves. Our stories were peopled with burgomasters, district leaders, local group leaders, and even cell leaders. We spread over them a slime of obloquy, as foul as that which they themselves had spread over the Jews. Goebbels was shifting his philosophy of propaganda. After the 4th year of war, all men think differently of war than they did at the beginning. Expressions such as patriotism and enthusiasm are quite out of place. The German people simply does its duty. That is all. Denunciations became even more common. In a typical case, a factory worker was sentenced to a year in prison for merely passing on what he heard on the BBC to colleagues. There were 11 death sentences for radio crime that same year. Goebbels' stress on a mix of fear and denial posed new problems for Delmer and British propaganda. If one were designing a type of media that felt safe for a scared, increasingly sceptical, but patriotic civilian or soldier in the Reich, how should you do it? For starters, you would want the regime's leaders, ideally Hitler and Goebbels, delivering their speeches on this medium. Even the nosiest neighbour or the Gestapo would see nothing suspicious in a station that played live broadcasts of Sportpalast speeches. And if your presenters sent personal messages of support to sailors on U-boats, knew exactly who was on which boat and where they were sailing, then how could this information not come from the Nazi Navy Command? It could feel safe in other ways too. Dance music to keep your spirits up, and a female presenter with a voice like Glühwein. And it would feel positively vital if it could tell you which specific areas the British were bombing with their ever more frequent air raids. Soldatensender Calais on medium wave, also broadcast as Radio Atlantic on shortwave, had all these safety features. From 1943, it was listened to from U-boats under the Atlantic and Messerschmitts in the sky. The SS leader for Munich identified it as one of the city's 3 most popular stations. At Woburn, Delmer was no longer working with 3 men in a billiards room. He was producing the Soldatensender with about 100 collaborators. Inside were editors, writers, researchers, recording studios, DJ booths, technicians. In one room sat a curious apparatus resembling an early fax machine, with a telephone connected to transistors and a ticker tape punching out words in columns. This was the Hellschreiber, an essential toy in the box of media magic tricks that enabled Delmer to counterfeit Nazi radio. Hellschreibers were a familiar sight in Nazi newsrooms. Through them, the government sent out official statements. A German news agency had left one behind when it bolted from England at the start of the war, and it had made its way to Woburn. The Soldatensender was broadcast live, and the team could get the messages from the Hellschreiber on air right away, often faster than the more sluggish German stations. Broadcasting live allowed Delmer's team to tune into speeches being given on the Nazi radio and replay them on their own wavelength. The Soldatensender Calais, the presenter would announce, in common with all other stations in this Reich network, now takes you over to the Sportpalast in Berlin, where you will hear the address of the Führer. As the chief technician switched over the wavelengths, the studios would erupt with laughter and shouts, encouraging the presenters to interrupt Goebbels or Hitler with a rude comment in one of their pauses. Delmer would calm them down. "One operation at a time, my children. We are doing this for cover, 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 and nothing else. No dirt this time." Max Braun now had a team of 6. His library of cards with the stories of Nazi officials great and small, and their corrupt lifestyles, had grown so large it needed several huts. The armed forces shared intelligence with Delmer's team, from the latest U-boat movements to the precise locations of their air raids. Resistance movements provided rumours from brothels and bars. They could even predict promotions for U-boat crews before they were announced. Tom Stevens, an Oxford classics professor, worked out how many tons of Allied ships a commander needed to sink to gain a new decoration. When Navy intelligence supplied them with Allied losses, they could go to their records of who was on which U-boat and work out who was due to be awarded. The ultimate aim was to draw out what Delmer called the inequalities of sacrifice between the common man and the privileged party elites. But instead of the angry screeds of Der Chef, content about party corruption and privileges was delivered as formal bits of news. At the same time, the sender encouraged listeners to feel they could stand up to the Nazis by showing how weak the authorities were becoming. The sender was also the soldier's friend. When it reported on the bombings on the home front, it kindly reminded servicemen that they were due comfort leave if their families were affected. The sender was not only live and vastly more varied in content than Der Chef. Its ultimate aim was not to convince the listeners the station was something it wasn't. This wasn't a classic black operation. Delmer understood many listeners would work out that the station was likely to be British. Their news was too keen to point the finger of blame at Nazi officials. So here was a radio program pretending to be Nazi, which understood its listeners knew that it wasn't, and whose listeners tuned in because they needed the emotional and physical safety of play acting, as if they thought it might be Nazi after all. The music on the sender played a similar game. Vicky, the force's darling, would open each show with her trademark, "This is Vicky, with 3 kisses for you." She played plenty of jazz banned by the Nazis, yet popular among young soldiers. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Glenn Miller. But this American music never had any English lyrics. All songs were in German, as with the big band crooners on the Reichsradio. So listeners could point to the approved Nazi tunes while enjoying the band music too. Between tunes, Vicky gave women news of their loved ones at the front, and soldiers information about their families' whereabouts after heavy air raids, which the sender knew the location of as soon as it happened, thanks to the RAF. Delmer compared Vicky to Circe in the Odyssey, tempting Nazi sailors and soldiers to grow despondent. The treacle in her voice would never let you suspect that this Circe had lost half her family in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Vicky's real name was Agnes Bernell. She was 20 and had come to England with her father, Rudolf Bernauer, a Jewish playwright and cabaret impresario. He created her persona, wrote her scripts, and later the songs that she would perform. The evidence for reception for Radio Atlantic grew quickly. 80 prisoners of war captured between June and October 1943 had listened to or heard about Atlantic, although most realized it was foreign. 6 months later, the number had almost doubled. Several expressed admiration of the cleverness of its cover, saying that if an officer entered the room during an Atlantic news bulletin, listeners were able to prove that they sincerely believed it to be an ordinary German station. It was also useful. One U-boat commander said that German submarine flotillas learned of the loss of their boats from U-boat transmitter Atlantic. Delmer had pulled off something unprecedented with the sender. He had created a medium that was both safe for those who were not comfortable with taking risks, that let them hang on to their desire for a collective identity, but was simultaneously thoroughly subversive. He had created a medium that stimulated independent thought and even action. The Nazi elite was soon aware of the problem. The so-called Soldatensender Calais, Goebbels wrote in November 1943, which clearly originates in England, gave us something to worry about. The station does a very clever job of propaganda, and from what is put on the air, one can gather the English know exactly what they have destroyed in Berlin. The more the Nazis paid attention to it, the riskier it became for those who worked there. If a German employee's voice was recognized by the Nazis, their families would face retribution back home. In October 1943, Frank Linder went to see his sister in Surrey. A weeping wretch opened the door. She pulled a letter out of her apron pocket. "Our mother has been transported from the old Czech fortress of Theresienstadt, further eastwards to Auschwitz." "Does that mean that Mutti is dead?" "Not necessarily," I said. But I knew the truth only too well. My beloved, distinguished mother, who always spent so much time and money on looking elegant and well-groomed, had been stripped naked and murdered with several hundred others in a gas chamber. By early afternoon, Linda was back at Woburn, asking over and over, "Is it my fault? Is it all my fault? Did they recognize my voice on the radio? Is murdering my old lady the Nazi swine's revenge?" Towards the evening, Delmer called me into his office. He didn't say much, and he didn't mention the subject, but he was very sensitive. I wanted to howl. Then he said to me, "There is only one form of therapy: work, and more work. And that's what you are going to do, Sergeant. I have a few things lined up for you. In fact, you'll be so busy you won't have a moment to think about Auschwitz." He wasn't lying. Big things were afoot at Woburn. Delmer was now Director of Special Operations Against the Enemy and Satellites. He was in charge of all things covert and German and all operations in Nazi-allied countries. Our canteen became a Tower of Babel, he remembered, as dark-eyed gypsy beauties from the Balkans flirted with my fair-haired German prisoners over toad-in-the-hole, powdered egg omelettes, spam fritters, and other irresistible delicacies from the repertory of wartime cooks. Under his stewardship, some of the programming became ever more Delmer-esque. The simplest and most effective of all black operations, he wrote, is to spit in a man's soup and cry, "Heil Hitler." Delmer's work was ceaseless. One contemporary wrote, "From 9 until 2 in the morning, discussions on new projects and new themes were only broken by listening to his own station or even rival ones. I have seen him, sitting on his vast settee, reading through a paragraph of talk, muttering crossly to himself. Then, stopping in the middle of a sentence, a worried wrinkle would appear on his large brow, and, retrieving at least one of his shoes, and giving his braceless trouser a heave, he would stump rapidly out of the room to impart a brilliant idea to one of his writers, probably by that time in bed." Delmer often drove his team of co-workers to the brink of breakdown, but we made life easier with humour and by playing silly tricks on each other. You could call our little games infantile, but they helped us get through. "I do not know to this day," wrote Delmer, "whether it was due to a natural mischievousness or whether it was the psychological effect of the work we were doing, but the members of my team were forever playing tricks, either on each other or on my guests, or on me. A moral ambiguity implicit in hoaxes and black humour pervades his propaganda project. The word trick turns up continuously in his writing. Hitler's propaganda, he declared, could be defeated only with a trick." In 1944, Delmer's trickery was about to be tested to the hilt. The Allied invasion of Nazi Europe, D-Day, was approaching. He was one of the few initiated into plans for the invasion. The unreliable outsider had been allowed inside because of his ability to imitate the enemy. His D-Day propaganda would show his tricks at their most flamboyant and their most amoral. As the war worsened for the Nazis, Joseph Goebbels tried to make sacrifice more attractive. In mid-1943, he commissioned a colour film on the siege of the German town of Kolberg on the Baltic by Napoleon's armies. The budget was 8.5 million Reichsmarks, twice that of most Nazi films. He hired 4,000 sailors and 187,000 soldiers to act in the battle scenes, when the real front desperately needed them. The film was to be a hymn to death. Goebbels wrote the speeches extolling sacrifice himself. Picking apart the attraction of heroic death was Delmer's focus in the preparation for D-Day. His main job was to soften up German troops, to develop the desire to defect, desert, and generally make them less willing to sacrifice themselves for Hitler's cause. He recruited Cambridge professor John T. McCurdy, who visited Woburn weekly, guiding a sustained project to undermine Goebbels' propaganda of glorious death and to encourage German soldiers to abandon their missions. A psychiatrist who had, since World War I, researched the mental states of soldiers, he believed that some soldiers yearned for death, to relieve the stress of war in an honourable way, or to rid themselves of the burden of responsibility. Others wished to save themselves with an injury that would get them sent home. As D-Day approached, German soldiers, sailors and airmen would have felt most fortunate to find a pack of Efka cigarette papers someone left on a cafe table or in a train. But when they opened them, instead of cigarette papers, they found 10 tightly folded sheets of thin paper. On these sheets, they found excerpts from a manual titled Illness Saves, authored by a certain Dr. Dogood. There was an introductory letter, followed by instructions and delicate drawings of various plants. What did this paradoxical title mean? How can illness save? The doctor explained the dangers of war strain after years of service, how fatigue built up quietly and could cause a breakdown at any moment. Lack of knowledge about this was clearly a disaster in waiting for a military unit during an operation. Indeed, this oversight in medical science meant it was the soldier's patriotic duty to fake illness and get sent home or to hospital. McCurdy, who was behind Dr. Dogood, insisted that the malingerer must give the physician the impression that here is a patriotic citizen dedicated to his duty who has the misfortune to be ill, despite himself. The rest of the manual was filled with examples for how to give yourself serious symptoms without causing lasting damage. For a throat infection, apply silver nitrate on the tonsils and swallow a small amount of gunpowder. For violent diarrhea, munch the dried seeds from the corn cockle flower. There was a whole appendix of beautifully drawn flora that caused rashes, lesions, burns, and blisters. For Delmer, these malingering manuals had a double purpose: to help soldiers get out from the front lines, but also to force German military medics to trust their patients less, as they knew about the existence of the manuals. This in turn meant that real patients would suffer, increasing enmity between medics and soldiers. As D-Day approached, Delmer had a new office in central London. Here, he received members of resistance groups working covertly inside German-controlled territory. They had been flown from secret European landing strips to London, right under the noses of the supposedly all-seeing SS, to be briefed on their roles in D-Day. Delmer had one big ask of the experts in physical disintegration. When they killed a German, it should look like it was done by a German resistance movement. In the absence of a genuine anti-Nazi struggle, he wanted to simulate one and confuse the Gestapo and SS. Stories of Nazis murdered by mysterious German resistance movements would then be reinforced on the sender. Delmer also requested letters be sent to the grieving relatives of recently killed German servicemen. These forged letters were written on the letterheads of German hospitals and claimed to be from a fellow patient who had witnessed the last, often painful hours of the deceased. They wrote movingly to the distraught parents about how nobly their dead child had struggled, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned a precious ring or crucifix that the deceased had given a Nazi official to send on to their relatives. The poor parents, Delmer calculated, would be upset. What had happened to these things? A little while later, the sender would be full of stories about the corpse robbers, corrupt Nazi officials who took away souvenirs left by dead soldiers to their loved ones. The Sender's presenters would solemnly read out names of those who had been burgled, the same names as in the letters. Instead of a glorious death and eternal glory, the Nazis were robbing people of their lives and treasures. Other letters accused them of even more terrible treatment. Dear Frau Müller, they told you that your son Heinz died from jaundice. This was not the case. We were in the same company, and he was a fine chap. They had to amputate his leg, and afterwards gave him a lethal injection. This often happens to war cripples. And Delmer's tricks were only getting dirtier. Some parents could never accept their sons had been killed in action. They were convinced they were being held by the Allies and wrote to the British and American governments. And even after the Allies explained that there was no trace of their children, some still couldn't accept the death and kept on writing to their children as if they were alive. Immensely moving they were, remembered Delmer. Dear Martin, your sister Erna is married to Fritz Clausen, and she now has a delightful little boy. She named him Martin after you. You are an uncle now. Do let us hear from you soon, dear boy. We think of you all the time. These dead letters made Delmer feel weepy, but he nevertheless took full advantage of them. Soon these parents were receiving mysterious letters. Dear Frau, please make no inquiries about the whereabouts of Martin. He is safe and well in a neutral country with a good job. When this terrible war Hitler caused is ended, he will either return to you or send for you. He asks me to send his best greetings to you and Erna. Please tell no one about this letter. Delmer calculated that no parents would be able to resist the temptation of passing the good news of their son's salvation to at least one close friend, and thus the news of the successful desertion of German soldiers to neutral countries would spread, and more Germans, I hoped, would be encouraged to follow their example. It was, Delmer admitted, the only one of our many operations against the Germans of which I feel a little ashamed when I think of it today. So he tried to make up for it in his own weird way. The deceived parents received food hampers from neutral countries, supposedly sent from their resurrected children, that showed how good life was beyond the Reich. Some of the grateful parents became our best propagandists. One old baronial lord of the manor in Pomerania was so moved, he placed it on a table in front of his house and made the whole of the village march past the parcel to inspect what his dear son had sent his old father from over there. I felt sorrier than ever, but this time they were at least getting something out of it, something to eat. But he was proud of his Nachrichten für die Truppen, his most ambitious D-Day project. Nachrichten was a daily newspaper. The team of 25 started production at 11 p.m. when the editors took the latest Sender broadcasts, adapted them for text, added photos and maps. At 3 a.m., a dispatch rider would take proofs to Delmer's rooms and wake him. The editing suite telephone would soon ring with Delmer shouting changes, which were fixed before the copy was sent to be printed, guillotined, and packed. At 6 p.m., U.S. Army trucks drove the newspapers to Cheddington, home to the U.S. leaflet bombers. 9,000 leaflets could flutter down over an area of 1 square mile, so by night time, hundreds of thousands of copies were over enemy lines, ready to be read by German soldiers in the morning, often earlier than the Nazi newspapers. This was one of the most dangerous news runs in history. In French fields and roadsides, German soldiers picked up the newspaper. They knew it wasn't German. It used neutral language and matter-of-factly reinforced how the German army was losing and how it was time to think about self-preservation, not self-sacrifice. In the weeks leading to D-Day, the Sender gave more details about supply shortages for the army, about how all the best kit was going to the Eastern Front, and General Rommel was coming up with an absurd plan to attack England with gliders. The news was rife with examples of desertion, sabotage, and insubordination. For listeners across Europe, on June the 6th, the Sender was the first radio to break the story of the landings, reporting at 4:50 a.m. while Goebbels' radio still slumbered. The enemy is landing with force from the air and from the sea. The Atlantic wall is penetrated in several places. As the German prisoners of war and émigré newsreaders gathered for programs the week of D-Day, Delmer thought he could detect that despite their desire for Hitler's Germany to perish, these men watched their countrymen across the Channel being bludgeoned into extinction with a secret sympathy and sadness. Not for nothing had we immersed ourselves so completely in the life of our Wehrmacht listeners, and the talks which my speakers now put out reflected this. They had in them an undertone of personal tragedy which made these ephemeral pieces of psychological warfare as moving for me to listen to as if they had been the greatest literature. To Delmer's ears, the speech of Halket, one of his most brilliant team members, was the best of the lot. He delivered it in the staccato rhythm of a Prussian officer. It began, "This is a report, an epitaph, a warning. It is a warning to all of those who may be lying in an outpost somewhere on the beaches, or are stationed somewhere up on a hill, or on the coast. And as they lie there, they may get the order, 'Hold on, the reinforcements are on their way to you.' The reinforcements will not come. They cannot come, because nothing is being done about sending reinforcements, because all these men have been written off as dead and lost." Delmer thought that it was a brilliant performance, and that behind it was genuine misery and bitterness in Halket's voice. Part of it, Delmer judged, may have been conscious acting, but most of it he thought was genuinely felt, the resentment and sorrow of an officer seeing his fellow countrymen laying down their lives for a regime of criminals and cranks. Interviewed decades later, Halket never confirmed or denied whether he had any genuine feelings during his speech, but he resented how Delmer had reduced him to something of a caricature, a Prussian officer with German sympathies. One can understand his frustration. He was an artist, a professional actor. He was one of the creative forces at Woburn, co-editor and lead writer of Nachrichten, always innovating on the radio shows. And who was Delmer to define when he was genuine and when he was acting? Who was Delmer to define what reality was, what the truth was in the first place?